for example, those with certain deeply held religious convictions. Before such a system was introduced, a high-profile information campaign to make the public aware of it would be essential. I understand that in 2011-12 alone, the Scottish Government spent £500,000 on raising awareness of and encouraging organ donor registration, and a new campaign was launched only 3 days ago. There is no reason why such funding could not be used to inform people of the change, whilst media coverage would undoubtedly help too. Across Europe, 24 countries have a form of presumed consent. As demonstrated in Spain, Belgium and France, soft opt-out has a number of benefits. Not only does it respect the rights of patients and families, but donation rates are much higher than here, or indeed in countries such as Austria, where hard opt-out policies in which relatives have no say are pursued. Although of secondary importance, it's worth noting that maintaining an opt-out database could be less costly than the current one, especially when one considers that fewer people would be likely to opt out of organ donation than currently opt in. The Spanish model of organ donation and transplantation is regarded as amongst the most successful in the world. Spain has the highest rate of organ donation ever reported across an entire population and, crucially, has maintained this success for many years. Spain has overseen discernible increases in organ donation and transplant activities since its overarching and consistent framework was established in 1989. This incorporates a network of highly motivated hospital doctors who personally take charge of the donation process, a task that involves opening up an empathetic dialogue with relatives of the deceased at the earliest possible opportunity. I believe that this is a role which could be fulfilled by the organ champions which the Organ Donation Task Force called for a few years ago. Implementation of the Spanish model has seen donation rate in Spain rise from 14.3 per million in 1989 to 35 now. Other countries have endeavoured to set up similar systems. In Tuscany, for example, where organ donations per million quadrupled in a decade since the establishment of a similar programme. I believe that after many years of discussion and debate, it is now time for the Scottish Government and this Parliament to take decisive action to improve the life chances, quality of life and reduce the needless suffering of hundreds of Scots. The soft opt-out option would save dozens of lives every single year. I know that the Cabinet Secretary backed such a policy in a previous life and hope the Minister will also do so today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a very popular debate, so speeches of a maximum of 4 minutes, and if members could take a bit less time, I'd be obliged. Patricia Ferguson, to be followed by Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I congratulate Kenny Gibson for securing this debate today, and may I apologise profusely to you, Presiding Officer, to Mr Gibson and to my colleagues, as I'll have to leave the chamber at the conclusion of my contribution. I know Mr Gibson will not take it amiss when I say that I do not find myself able to support the motions he submits to Parliament very often, but on this motion and on this issue, he has my full support. There are today some 650 people in the UK waiting for a donor organ. That's 650 people who are unable to live their lives to the full, 650 people who have to cope every day with pain and discomfort, and 650 people and their families living with the stress and anxiety of wondering when or if an organ might become available that is a match for them. Those 650 people know that with the medical advances of recent years, a replacement organ is likely to be successful and to transform their lives, freeing them from the restrictions their ill health imposes, often allowing them to go back to work and to live full and meaningful lives. What is also significant is that when asked, some 90% of people support organ donation, but less than 50% are actually registered on the NHS organ donor register. An even more depressing figure is, as Mr Gibson said, that Scotland has one of the lowest organ donation rates in the world at approximately 13 per million. That suggests to me, Presiding Officer, that people in Scotland are dying unnecessarily because some of us just haven't got around to signing up as donors. And that is why I support the motion before us today, and why I was so pleased to sign up to the Evening Times campaign, and why I congratulate NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde on its Respect My Dying Wish campaign. I recognise, as did Mr Gibson, that there must be safeguards to ensure that vulnerable people are not exploited or coerced, and I personally believe that young people under 16 should be exempt. And of course there will be those whose religious beliefs do not allow organ donation, And 2, there will be occasions when a bereaved individual has extreme concerns about the organs of their loved one being harvested, and we must respect those views. But sensible solutions work elsewhere and can work here too. Presiding Officer, in my lifetime, the first UK organ transplant took place in the UK. The world's first heart transplant was carried out, and the organ donor scheme that we have today was launched. We've come a long way, but it's now time to go further and to adopt the kind of scheme that has increased organ donation in other countries by between 25 and 30%. If we achieved the same percentage increase, we would take 195 people off that waiting list. Surely, for the sake of those 195 people and their families, it's time to change to a system of presumed consent. Presiding Officer, I sincerely hope Kenny Gibson's motion leads to progress in this matter, and I look forward to playing my part in future debates on legislation in this area.
Thank you very much. I now call Dennis Robertson to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I congratulate my colleague and friend Kenneth Gibson for bringing this members' debate to the Chamber. Presiding Officer, if I may, I would like to present a personal story to the Chamber. Presiding Officer may recall that in this Chamber I related the story with regard to my daughter in February this year. My daughter Caroline died 21 months ago, and Caroline's wish was to be able to donate her organs so other people would have the gift of life, or indeed maybe recovering sight. Caroline, as a youngster, had a firm belief that this would be a wish, and unfortunately she didn't realise that it would be a wish that would come to her at such a young age. Presiding Officer, Caroline's condition meant that her organs could not be used. However, she had healthy eyes and the tissues from her cornea were indeed transplanted. But, Presiding Officer, perhaps a lot of people are not aware that what happens is that when you agree for organs or tissues to be transplanted and certainly removed, you undergo a process. And during that process, you have to complete an authorisation and a patient assessment. Now, this came as a surprise to myself and my family. Having just lost our daughter, and indeed Fiona, her sister, we were presented with the support of the chaplain, Mr James Faulkner at Aberdeen Royal, whom we're eternally grateful to. But we had a transplant coordinator who sat with us and explained the process. And this is a process that is an administrative one, Presiding Officer, which takes away, I suppose, the personal issues. And there was a great deal of explanation and indeed sensitivity. And to some extent, there was an apology of having to go through this. But in terms of ensuring that the process was correct and that we could proceed with the donation of Caroline's organs, or indeed her cornea, we had to go through this process. And this is where we learnt that Caroline's organs would not be suitable for transplant. Presiding Officer, it is a process that I believe that ensures that organ donation is only carried out with those who do have consent. So therefore, having presumed consent, which I support fully, has the soft option there. It has a built-in safeguard for those who do not wish to proceed. The families, relatives, indeed partners, whomever is next to that person who's perhaps just lost their life. Presiding Officer, I feel that my daughter gave life to another. Not because she saved a life, but perhaps she's given an ability for a new life. But I hope that her corneas have given someone the sight to live their life as full as possible. Presiding Officer, we should support this presumed consent And I sincerely hope that one day, like Patricia Ferguson, that we can support the legislative programme. And once again, can I congratulate Kenneth Gibson for bringing this to the Chamber. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Presiding Officer, can I congratulate Kenneth Gibson for bringing forward this important motion, and also apologise to him, to the Presiding Officer and to the Minister, since I'm sponsoring the launch of the National Dementia Carers Action Network in Committee Room 3 at 1 o'clock. Now, the figure of 650 patients waiting for a transplant has already been much quoted in this debate, and to that we should remember the figure of 43 who actually died last year waiting for a transplant. So in view of that, I take an entirely pragmatic view to this subject and would support any policies which bring about a greater number of organ donations. In coming to such a decision, of course, I would want to listen in particular to those who are closely involved with the service and also look at the evidence from other countries. Now, a figure that perhaps wasn't so well known until relatively recently was that 15% of potential organs are lost because relatives do not follow the stated wishes of their loved ones. And of course, it was that figure that led to the Respect My Dying Wish campaign, which was only launched relatively recently, but which I certainly support very strongly. And I'm sure we're all impressed with the way in which they're using Facebook and Twitter to get the message out. And I certainly, along with many others, have done everything I can to promote and support that campaign. And I don't think anyone in the Chamber would think differently. But of course, there is an interesting point here that the leader of that campaign, Professor Kevin Rooney, is not actually persuaded of the benefits of an opt-out system. In the Sunday Times of the 7th of October, he is quoted as saying it could be counterproductive, and then he goes on to say, and I quote directly, "As pro-organ donation, I think you risk losing more people than gaining them." So certainly, when I read that, it did give me pause for thought. And I suppose the point is that relatives are much more likely to agree if a positive view has been expressed, and indeed there are figures from the campaign to back that up, because apparently 90% will say yes if the relatives have expressed a positive view, whereas only 40% of relatives will say yes if no such view has been expressed. Now, under the system we have at present, relatives' views are always respected. Now, strictly speaking, in terms of the 2006 legislation, that is not necessary. The concept of authorisation was introduced by that legislation, and strictly speaking, the views of relatives can be overridden. But I think everyone is speaking within a context in which relatives' wishes are respected. So I do personally have a bit of a worry about the loss of a positive list, since the evidence does seem to be that relatives are much more likely to say yes if a positive wish has been expressed, rather than the failure to express a negative wish, if that's the correct way to describe the opt-out system. So it just gives me pause for thought, and it also made me remember that, in fact, which I referred to in the last debate on this, that Belgium apparently has two lists, an opt-in list and an opt-out list. Now, thinking about that, it seems cumbersome, and I don't entirely see how it would work successfully in practice, but I am told Belgium is the most successful country in Europe in terms of organ donation, so perhaps we ought to look at the system in Belgium, where they do manage to get round this problem of not having a positive list by actually having two lists. So, as indicated, I am entirely open-minded about opt-out and would certainly support it if I was convinced that it would lead to more organ donations. I certainly have no principled objection to an opt-out system, but I am not fully persuaded, although obviously I'll read other speeches in the debate later on. But what I, in conclusion, would definitely say is that I'm a very strong supporter of the Respect My Dying Wish campaign, and I hope that goes from strength to strength.
Thank you. I now call Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Anne McTaggart.
Presiding Officer, like others, I congratulate Kenny Gibson in securing this important debate. Coming, as I do, from a substantially medical family, demise of a range of people is something to which I've been close much of my life. I personally move from the words in Mr Gibson's motion where he says recognises calls to introduce a system of presumed consent to a position of very positive advocacy for presumed consent, coupled, of course, with my respecting those who view the remains of deceased relatives in a way different from me. Malcolm Chisholm made international comparisons, and I think it is important that we look further at that issue. One of my nieces is the transplant coordinator for Queensland in Australia, and when my father-in-law died at a comparatively early age, some 40 years ago, his entire remains went for donation, medical research and the training of students. It was very interesting that we had the funeral in the absence of a coffin, and how that changed the dynamic and the emotional charge for all who attended to a different place, much more positively thinking about the achievements and contribution of my late father-in-law, less being fixated about the presence of his remains. My mother-in-law, who died much later, wished the same, but for practical reasons, we were unable to have her preserved for research within the 48-hour time limit that applies, because she had the grave misfortune to die on the first day of a 3-day weekend. And sometimes these things happen. My wife and I have left instructions that others are to have the use of all and any of our remains. In each of our lives, we can look back at some of our achievements with pride, if we're lucky. Others will remember these after we depart and confer upon us some degree of immortality. But how much more our contribution is when we allow someone else to live on after we no longer do. Modern medical technology can keep many living beyond the point of failure of critical organs. Most of us will be familiar with kidney dialysis, but few will be aware of the cost of professional, social and practical effects of living with dialysis. So when a kidney failure sufferer gets a transplant, it doesn't just prolong life, it dynamically changes life. And in a country, as we are, where the majority of people die without making a will, we have substantial evidence that people are broadly reluctant to engage with the issue of their own mortality. We know that people simply like to not think about it. So I think, like others, there is time to think very positively about this. 2 actions. Give legal force to clearly express desires that the deceased has made, that they wish their organs to be used after death. I think we have to look at giving paramountcy to that over the interests of the deceased. Because after all, you can make a will about your tangible assets. It's time to think whether we can do that about your mortal remains. Secondly, let's move to the presumption that the organs of the newly deceased may be reused. It needs the strong protections for those of faith or other beliefs to make sure that it's not a repugnant act for those who are affected. It's not a matter for hasty legislation. We do need to consult widely, but other countries have done it, and we ought to be able to. NHS staff, I just say, personal experience, have a degree of delicacy and difficulty in talking to people about imminent demise. I think we've got to look at training NHS staff. Let me just say, other countries have done it. It's time for us to do likewise. The My Dying Wish campaign is absolutely excellent, and I'm very happy, like others, to support it.
Thank you. Anne McTaggart, to be followed by Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank Kenny Gibson for securing this afternoon's debate. I'm delighted to take part in this important debate on the subject of presumed consent for organ donation in Scotland. I know that this is a particularly sensitive subject, and I recognise there will be a wide range of views held on the proposed adoption of such a system. I would like to begin by acknowledging the serious and difficult circumstances faced by thousands of people currently on the waiting list for organ transplant operations. I am sure that those on all sides of this debate would agree that positive actions need to be taken urgently to address this situation. At this time, over 600 Scottish people are on the waiting list for a transplant operation, and on average, 3 people die each day as a result of no suitable organs being available in time. The campaign to raise awareness of this issue by the NHS
Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board and the Evening Times newspaper, has highlighted some of the key issues that need to be fully considered in the course of this debate. Principally, whether an opt-out system would result in a greater number of organs being made available for transplant, and subsequently how many lives this would save as a result. And as we have heard throughout the earlier speeches, at present around 40% of Scottish people have signed up to the Organ Donation Register. This compares favourably with a number of international examples of opt-in systems, similar to the UK model of the Organ Donation Register. However, international examples of opt-out systems have also shown us that organ donations tend to be between 25% and 30% higher compared with a system where individuals have to register to donate. This trend has been consistent and illustrates the ambition that adopting a new system in Scotland could play a vital role in saving lives. Recent studies assessing public support for organ donation have found the intention to register to be as high as 90%, whilst in parts of the UK actual registration is as low as 25%. This is strong evidence to suggest that an opt-in system could increase access for those who are unaware of the current process and encourage greater awareness of the impact that organ donation can have. I believe that many more Scots that are currently on the organ donor list would be in favour of registering and may have not yet done so as a result of only lack of information or the time constraints of leading busy and active lives. The comparably high percentage of those already registered as donors suggests that our population is receptive to the idea of organ donation and that many more would be comfortable with being added to the list of potential donors in the future. Though I do support the adoption of an opt-out process and believe the benefits of such a system to outweigh the administration challenges of its operation, I also believe that it must be accompanied by high quality and readily available information on how to be removed. It is unacceptable to have large numbers of people registered as donors who would be unhappy with that arrangement, and it would be unacceptable to cause unnecessary distress to families after the death of a loved one. That is why the process for opting out should be made simple, and that patients should routinely be asked of their continued consent at all available opportunities. To finish, Presiding Officer, it is clear that we have a crisis in organ donation in Scotland, and tough decisions have to be made to rectify this devastating reality. An opt-out system would act as a prompt for those who are currently in favour of registering to have this process completed for them, and would undoubtedly save many lives as a result.
Thank you. Before I call the next speaker, can I just advise the Chamber that due to the number of members who still wish to speak in the debate, I am minded to accept a motion from Kenneth Gibson under Rule 8.14.3 that the debate be extended by up to 30 minutes.
So moved.
Thank you very much. Is the Chamber agreed? Thank you. I now call Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Drew Smith.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I join with others in congratulating Kenny Gibson on securing today's debate? And can I also thank the Cystic Fibrosis Trust, Scottish Kidney Foundation, British Heart Foundation Scotland, the BMA Scotland for their very informative and helpful joint briefing. And I hope he doesn't mind me singling them out, but I also want to thank Dennis Robertson for his very moving testimony. I certainly appreciate him having the strength of character to come here and talk about what can only have been a very painful experience. Presiding Officer, we've had a debate on this issue previously. On the 24th of January 2008, there was a members' debate secured by our departed colleague, Lord Fowkes, and I recall that Kenny Gibson spoke that day as well. And on that day, I mentioned that part of my motivation for speaking was I have a friend with cystic fibrosis who may someday require a lung transplant, and that forms part of the same motivation today. And at that time, the last debate, I set out that my friend was in pretty good health, pretty good shape, and it was quite conceivable that someday he may need a lung transplant. And indeed, my friend contacted me just in the last few days to say that he will be assessed for
a lung transplant on the 17th of December, and I obviously wish him well. I have to say, though, even if he is assessed as requiring a lung transplant, with the current system we have, there is no guarantee he will get that lung transplant. And since the January 2008 debate, that nothing has changed to alter my perspective that the time is now right to go for a system of presumed consent. Indeed, if anything, my belief is deeper now, given the experience since the intervening period, because, as Patricia Ferguson mentioned, there are some 650 individuals in Scotland waiting for a donor organ. And indeed, the briefing I mentioned earlier sets out that every day throughout the UK, 3 people die waiting for a donated organ. And I make that since the period in which we had that debate in 2008, that's some 5,000, over 5,000 people who have died across the United Kingdom. Members will forgive me if my calculation is slightly wrong, but that is a significant number of people. Indeed, not all of these lives, of course, would have been saved if we had a system of presumed consent, but I do believe that many could have been. And we do know that support for donation exists. It's widespread. I think the point has been made. Kenny Gibson made the point, up to 90% of people support organ donation, but for whatever reason, only about half, in fact less than half, of Scotland's population is registered on the NHS donor register. So we have to square that circle. The question is, how do we square that circle where there is big support for organ donation but lower levels of registration? And I think it is right to consider now how we increase organ donation, and I reflect the fact that 70% of the population support an opt-out scheme. I want to finish, also, by touching on some of the concerns that have been expressed about such a scheme. It's been suggested that some people have philosophical, moral, religious objection to any opt-out scheme. I have to say, if those individuals have such strong beliefs, I cannot see how they will not do anything other than opt-out. If they seriously hold those beliefs, they will presumably opt-out. In terms of those unable to consent, it is clear that we can design a system that those who cannot consent will not be included in that system, be that those under the age of 16 or 18. There's perhaps an argument for either age, and indeed vulnerable adults. They will not be, of course, included in the system. And the great red herring that is, it's not been thrown out today, I'm glad to hear, but I've heard it said that some doctors will willfully neglect some patients so they can get the organs for others. That is not going to happen. It's clearly not going to happen. It runs counter to the Hippocratic Oath. So we hear those concerns, but it's not beyond us to design a system that takes account of them. I congratulate Kenny Gibson for securing today's debate, and I hope it's not long before we're actually debating legislation on this matter.
Thank you. Once again, can I make an appeal for brevity? Drew Smith, to be followed by Jackson Carlaw.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I begin also by both congratulating and thanking Kenneth Gibson for bringing this debate forward. A few years ago, I had the chance to be a bone marrow donor. However, that experience is not what I want to talk about today. Rather, I simply want to use that to put what I say in this context. By making a blood donation, a marrow donation, or perhaps a living kidney donation, we are giving a gift, but we're also benefiting from a unique and rewarding opportunity. It is a gift which is in our own gift. An organ donation after death should be no different. But Kenny Gibson was right to say that under the current system we have no guarantee that the decisions taken in life will be respected in death. We know that 90% of Scots support organ donation, and that less than half of us carry the donor card. Yet only a tiny percentage of us, as Dennis Robertson reminded us, will die in circumstances where organ donation might be possible. At present, the gift is not our own, but rather might be for our relatives to make for us. Despite progress in improving our system, the fundamental problem with our register and the way we ask people to make this difficult choice remains. I believe that a change from opt-in to, as Kenny Gibson described, soft opt-out would help to support families unsure of what they should do. And we know that many families who say no go on to regret the choice that they have made for their loved ones. It would mean that those who wish to donate could have greater confidence that our wishes would be respected, and we know because the evidence tells us that it would increase the number of donations. This simple change, Presiding Officer, would save lives. The change is simple, and there is evidence that 70% of us already support such a move, even although we haven't yet had the detailed debate which might reassure many of those who continue to have concerns. This is not a change which I instinctively supported, but is one which I came to understand as others helped to bust the myths of so-called presumed consent. Whether a register is opt-in or opt-out, the fundamental choice remains the same. The choice to give remains something that we should celebrate, not take for granted. So faced as lawmakers with 650 people on organ waiting lists, it is our responsibility not to remove the choice, but to make the choice as easy as possible. More than 40 of us have signed this motion, and I always make an effort to sign as many of Mr Gibson's many motions as I can. Almost 60 of us signed a previous motion recognising the Evening Times campaign on this subject, which in itself is supported by 10,000 readers of that paper. With the support of the government presiding officer, we could make this change. We could save lives. I've said that this is a simple change, but I recognise that reassurance would be required. As Patricia Ferguson and others said, safeguards would be complex, new procedures would need to be detailed, and a significant public information campaign, Kenny Gibson was quite right to say, would be essential before we could get to the stage of a new register being made use of. Even if we all agreed today to do this, change would be years off, and in the meantime, more people will still die. For that reason, I consider the debate is both timely and urgent. The new Cabinet Secretary has previously indicated his personal support for opt-out, so today I would hope that the Minister might, in summing up, indicate whether the Scottish Government will bring forward a bill to achieve the change that we are seeking. If they are not minded to legislate, Presiding Officer, then I can indicate that I have had an initial discussion with the Non-Government Bills Unit and with the BMA, and I am considering lodging a proposal modelled on the bill which Labour has introduced in the Welsh Assembly as an alternative way forward. At the Health Committee this week, the Cabinet Secretary said he often looked to the opposition for ideas, but it's just that he didn't very often see any that he liked. I hope, well, in truth, this is not a party political matter, Presiding Officer, and I think speeches around the Chamber have demonstrated in that. But I would ask that the Government agrees to meet me, perhaps Mr Gibson and any other member who would like to be involved in making this change happen. It is, Presiding Officer, a change which would save lives, and it is a change which is in our gift.
Thank you. I now call Jackson Carlaw to be followed by Roderick Campbell.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I speak personally in this, as I did the last time this was debated in 2008, where, funnily enough, I think my line was very much in line with that of the Government at the time, which is that I'm certainly sympathetic to the arguments that are being promoted, but I was not at that point persuaded that the correct approach was to move to a change in the law at this point. I understand and thought Kenny Gibson made the medical imperative underpinning all of this very effectively. And I think that the Government is to be congratulated on the actions it has taken to improve the opt-in of many people over the last few years. The campaign that it initiated was successful, and there is another campaign underway. I think possibly the lesson of this is that whatever campaigns we have to be on a sustained basis, and we have to find ever more imaginative ways and opportunities when people are applying for documentation or whatever to see whether we can encourage people to opt in at those points. But I remember there was also one consideration in 2008 which we should also still bear in mind, and I think it's pertinent when one identifies Spain as one of the nations that we cite, and that is that there are other countries that are much more effective still than are we in the way in which they are able to process and make use of the donations that many people have offered by way of their organs, and that we aren't in this country yet as effective in that regard as are others. But I am slightly uncomfortable with the process identified in the briefing and as detailed, because I asked members to consider what it would actually involve. It would actually involve every adult member in society being contacted and having to make a conscious decision, and for all that information to be collected and processed without error, and to be established on a base where it could be referred to without error. And am I confident, from everything else that has happened within the health service or elsewhere in life, in relation to the security and effectiveness of information systems to deliver that proposition? I have to say I am not. And I am particularly uncomfortable and concerned at the effect that there would be on public opinion if it came to be seen that organs were being removed from people who had, it was able later to be shown, sought not to be part of that process, but whose information had been incorrectly processed. Because I think that would undermine and damage public confidence, which, as members have identified already, is extremely high and in favour of the principle of organ donation. Now, I don't suggest that these propositions are insurmountable, or that there isn't work that could not be done to seek to find a path or a process by which the concerns I've got, which are, I don't know whether they're well-founded, but they strike me as being potentially concerns which could have a counterproductive effect, a little like Malcolm Chisholm was identifying, that he is willing to be persuaded but is not necessarily yet just persuaded, that if we turn on its head the process which is currently enjoying 90% of public support, that we will retain that public support in consequence. And so I'm willing for work to be done, but I would be uncomfortable if we were just very simply to commit to the proposition that we are about to make a change in this from what it is today to an opt-out process. That, I think, I remain sympathetic to, but not yet persuaded of.
Thank you very much. Roderick Campbell, to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. May I congratulate Kenneth Gibson on bringing this matter to the Chamber today. Most of the points that I was going to make have already been made, so I'll try and be as brief as possible. You can't take them with you. That's something we often hear when we talk about organ donation. It's a fundamental truth, nevertheless. This is clearly an issue which invokes strong emotion. After all, organs constitute our bodies. How much more personal can you get? But what should also evoke strong emotions is the current position. Surely a great shame that Scotland, when you consider the urgent demand for organs, people are dying without registering to become an organ donor. It's a great pity that many who would be happy to donate their organs in order to save a life did not get round to doing it. We've heard reference to the BMA poll. Other polls have found the figure to be much higher. We therefore need to ask why so few Scots, comparatively, are registered donors, and most importantly of all, we need to find a system where the number of people needing organ donations more closely matches the number of organs available. Presiding Officer, as ever, we would be well advised to look to our neighbours for some guidance when considering solutions. In Europe, there are more than 20 countries operating some form of opt-out system, and as others have said, the country with the highest level of donation in the world is Spain. Belgium is a close second, but Scotland is a long way behind, with only 13 donations per million in 2010. Nevertheless, there are some positives. We currently have a higher percentage of population on the organ donors register than any other part of the UK. In 2010, 37% of Scots have signed up, compared to 29% of people in the rest of the UK. But even in Scotland, there's a significant local variation in the percentage of people on the register. The Highlands is 47% on the register, but the Western Isles only 28%. The rate of people dying ultimately without need, highlighted in Kenneth Gibbson's motion, is, I believe, shameful, however, given the widespread public support for organ donation. But like others, I think we need to look at it in a slightly pragmatic way, and whilst I'm happy to support the motion, I would hope that any future legislative change will strike a workable balance between the strongly held objections of minorities, particularly those with religious beliefs, and the desperate need of people who are seriously ill in favour of extending their life and the quality of their life. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call Liam MacArthur to be followed by Mark Griffin.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's not often that it can be said, particularly around this time on a Thursday, that the Parliament is showing itself at its best, but I think that's very much the case during the course of this debate. I join others in congratulating Kenny Gibson on what I thought was a very compelling speech for pursuing this motion, as he does with all his other motions, with great tenacity, and I congratulate him on securing the debate. It notes that, with regret, the tragic death of 43 people in Scotland last year while awaiting organ transplant. I think it's probably worth putting on record the gratitude of everybody in this chamber for the work done by medical professionals and others, and most importantly those who make the difficult and selfless decision to donate organs, and indeed their families, which has resulted in 266 organs being retrieved from 81 deceased donors in Scotland in the last year, and 59 living donors donating one of their kidneys kidneys. Can I also thank the BMA and the other organisations for a very detailed and cogent briefing for this debate. And like Kenny Gibson, can I also thank Kim Karam, who not only is an authority on this issue, but acts as a research assistant to my colleague Tavish Scott. And can I commend her book, Donation, Transplantation and Conversation, to all members in the Chamber, not least because it will secure a £5 donation to my Movember campaign in aid of prostate cancer, but also because it is, I think, one of the most comprehensive and authoritative books on this issue. Kim Karam refers to an emotional, complex journey. I think in this instance she's talking about the journey made by somebody going through the process of deciding whether to offer their organs for transplant and those in receipt. But I think it also speaks to the challenge that faces us as legislators. I don't think this is just about a legal change. I think a number of members have made that point, and I think Jackson Carlo made a very interesting and persuasive counter-argument, if you like, that this is not just about a change in the law. There is a great deal that we need to do around about that, not least in terms of stimulating the public debate that hopefully this debate forms a part of, but in terms of the raising of public awareness and having the public debating these difficult, complex and sensitive issues far more thoroughly. In that sense, I think I would agree with Malcolm Chisholm that the NHS Glasgow and Clyde campaign addresses one aspect that is a shortcoming in the law as it currently stands, about people whose wishes do not appear to be being respected as often as they might. I think the use of social media recognises the need to stimulate that debate as widely as is possible. The Evening News, likewise, I think is to be commended on its Opt for Life campaign, but as well as the petitions and the articles that this campaign has involved, I think the important element of it is the stimulation of that debate. I think every member has referred to the widespread public support in Scotland that there is for organ donation, and yet the disconnect with those who actually sign up to the organ donor register. I think Roderick Campbell was very correct to point out that in a UK context, Scotland is performing relatively well, but in an international context, we clearly have a great deal to learn. There are complexities and sensitivities around this, as others have referred to. I think any system of presumed consent has to continue to involve the families. I think it is a leap too far to try to exclude them at this stage. And I think Dennis Robertson, in yet another very emotional but very powerful speech, set out some of the reasons why that is the case. Children, vulnerable adults, I think, again, perhaps fall into that category. But we will still, with this, have an active decision that is made. As Kim Karam has pointed out, though, discussions about opt-out and opt-in systems should not become a distraction from discussing the complex issues of organ donation as a whole. The Spanish system works better, not because it is an opt-out, but because of a range of reasons, including media support, better education, public acceptance of donation as the normal expectation after brainstem death.
Mr McCarthy, you must conclude, please.
And coordinators spending longer with families to talk through the process of expectations. I think we're on the complex journey at the moment. I look forward to continuing to take part in these debates, and I congratulate Kenneth Gibson again on securing today's debate.
I now call Mark Griffin to be followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I congratulate Kenny Gibson on securing the debate today on presumed consent this afternoon. It's a subject I feel very strongly on. I'll be speaking today mainly from a very personal experience of the organ donation system we have at the moment and the tremendous impact I believe moving to a system of presumed consent could have on the lives of those in the transplant waiting lists and their families. Almost 5 years ago to the day, a man was given the phone call he'd been waiting on for over 10 years. He was called and he was told that heart was available for him and that he should come into hospital and prepare for his transplant operation. He'd taken ill, as I said, 10 years before, and had been struggling with the diagnosed heart condition since. His health gradually deteriorating all the time. That man and his family made the trip to the hospital, said their goodbyes on the Saturday night, full of hope that the operation would lead to a much better quality of life. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. After the operation, he was placed in intensive care, and as you would expect, but the hope for recovery just didn't happen. The fact that he didn't recover, I feel, wasn't as a result of a failing in any care he received from NHS consultants who carried out the operation, or the intensive care nurses who sat vigilantly by his bedside 24/7 during the recovery period. The reason he didn't recover was because his kidneys and other organs had failed as a result of having to work so hard over the previous 10 years to compensate for that heart condition, and they just weren't strong enough to cope with the operation. And so, a matter of days after the surgery, he died at the age of just 47, a young man compared to the average age of death. He left behind a wife and family, 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, with the oldest being 22 and the youngest losing her dad at the age of 13. Today, he would have been 52 and would have been so proud to meet his very first grandson, Charlie, born just a few months ago. That's just one of the many family milestones missed over the past 5 years, and there will be many more over the years to come where his presence will be sorely missed. Of course, it's naive to expect everyone to survive a major heart operation like a heart transplant, but it's common sense for that person to be given the best chance of survival. They should have the operation as soon as possible after they've been placed on that waiting list. That's where this debate comes in. If we can follow the lead of the Welsh Government and push for a system of presumed consent, a system I think there's broad support for in the Chamber, albeit some people have concerns about how that's worked through, but I think that can be overcome. We could immediately boost the number of organs available for transplant so that people get access to those operations sooner. Put simply, we can save lives. I'd like to pay tribute to the Evening Times and the fantastic work they've done in the campaign for an opt-out system. During their campaign, they've highlighted research, as have others today, which has shown that even though 90% of people are in favour of organ donation, less than half of the population are on the organ donor register. And speaking from a personal point of view, and that raised by Mr Stevenson as well, the only thing that stopped me previously going on the organ donor register was an unwillingness as a young man to confront my own mortality. And I think that's a silly reason when you come to think about it, but that's something that we could overcome by a system of presumed consent. In closing, Presiding Officer, I would say that some members here will already know who I've spoken about earlier, and others will probably have guessed that the reason I've been able to speak so personally about organ donation is that the man I've described so far was my dad, lost to me, my mum, my brothers and sisters at such a young age. That's why I feel so strongly about it. That's why I supported the motion. That's why I'm speaking today, and that's why I would like to see this government introduce a system of presumed consent in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Christine Graham.
I too congratulate Kenny Gibson on securing this debate and share his huge regret, as we all have, at avoidable deaths and indeed reflect the individual stories today. I'm also on the donor register, but I do have substantial reservations about the proposal of presumed consent. I want to argue caution on presumed consent on 2 fronts, the principle and the practical. The principle of consent is that it must be informed, clearly expressed, and that the person consenting has capacity. The proposition is that consent will be presumed in the absence of registering on an opt-out register. Can I also say in passing, just because 90% of the public support organ donation doesn't mean that 90% of the public want to donate their organs. They may support it for other people. Now, let's look at the fact that at the moment we have almost 40% of the Scottish people on the donor register. We know that doesn't mean that the rest do not want to donate. Many, many of them simply won't get around to it in ordinary and busy life. And we also don't like, as Mark Griffin said so clear, we don't want to think of our own deaths, especially when we're very young. If you accept that, then why should failing to opt out not also be because we simply don't get around to it, just like most people? Unless, of course, we make opt-out compulsory. And I can't see, as Jackson Carlos so rightly said, how the entire population could be captured in this way. And if publicity campaigns... I've only got 4 minutes, I'm loveless. Can I take one and get a little bit extra? Right, thanks.
Kenneth Gibson.
The population would be the database, and obviously there would be lots of of publicity to enable people to opt out if they so wished. But remember, there's also a fail-safe with regard to the relatives of any deceased individual.
Christine Graham.
I'm actually coming to that, but I have to say to Kenny Gibson, if publicity campaigns for opt-in only raise 40%, I can't see how we're going to say publicity campaigns for opt-out will make it very watertight. How can we therefore say someone's wishes are clearly expressed? Further, we presume consent. We presume capacity, and capacity reaches far further, as you rightly said, Graham MacArthur, than simply age. And that's a serious erosion of a basic tenet of consent. Consent can only be given if you have capacity. Turning to practicalities in a short time, I want to quote from a now retired consultant anaesthetist in the A&E at the Western Infirmary in Edinburgh with 30 years' experience of organ donation. He said, "I think I would find it difficult to reassure grieving relatives that their loved one who had just died really did want to give his organs based on the fact that he had not registered an opt-out." So we have a counterproductive argument. At the moment, the possibility of organ donation may come up spontaneously from the family, but most often it's broached, usually after the first set of brainstem tests. Then the consultant asked whether the deceased expressed any wishes about donation, and indeed what the family's views were on the matter. And he says, "It's amazing how hard information about the deceased wishes, as expressed in the donor register, removes any doubt, and relatives are immediately able to agree to a donation." He goes on to say, "I've never personally had a family refuse a retrieval where the deceased held a donor card or was on the register." Now, this is a consultant who was involved in the first multi-organ donor in Dundee, was consultant in charge of the General and Neuro ICU at the Western from 1988 to 2002, and fostered a positive attitude to donation. He has seen how families came to terms with their grief at the sudden loss of their loved one and how this has been helped by the gift of the loved one's organs. But he says, "Please do not put this goodwill at risk for an unproven benefit in terms of available organs. If goodwill is lost, the potential losses of available organs could be much greater." I support, of course, the ends, but I say to the Chamber, be very, very careful that the means that you are putting forward are not counterproductive.
Thank you very much. Can I now invite the Minister to respond to the debate, and I call on Michael Matheson. Minister, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I, like others, begin by congratulating Kenny Gibson on securing time for this important debate, and to thank all members for their contribution, in particular those who have shared their own personal experience around organ donation, which has been extremely powerful. I recognise, as I think has been the case with this debate, that this is a topic where people hold strong views. But all of us, I'm sure, share the ultimate goal of finding a way to address the growing shortage of organs for transplantation. Now, members are aware that we don't currently have a policy of opt-out here in Scotland. That position is informed by the recommendations of the Organ Donation Task Force, who consider this issue in very great detail. Now, it may be helpful if I go over some of the reasons why the task force did not recommend a move to an opt-out system. They highlighted that health professionals told the task force of their concerns about the potentially negative implications a move to opt-out could have for clinical practice, something which was alluded to by Jackson Carlaw and further referred to by Christine Graham. There was also a suggestion that if opt-out were introduced, some intensive care practitioners might themselves opt out of participation in the donation programme. Now, I'm sure all members would recognise that that potentially would have very serious consequences, as many of the Organ Donation Task Force original recommendations are dependent upon these practitioners' cooperation. Now, several members have also made reference to experience with schemes in other parts of the world, and in particular in Europe. And the task force in their report commented on the fact that high donation rates in other European countries is often seen as a product of the opt-out system. And the task force heard from experts in Spain which has amongst the highest rates of organ donation in the world, a scheme which the Spanish government introduced back in 1979. Those experts, though, were clear that presumed consent was not the reason for their success. Donation rates only started to go up in Spain when changes were made to the transplant infrastructure, not the law on consent. And that infrastructure change took place in 1989, and Kenny Gibson made reference to the increasing numbers from that point on in Spain. It is also worth noting that in the US, where they have a consistently higher donation rate than many parts of Europe, they do not have an opt-out system in place. I'll give way to Liam MacArthur.
Liam MacArthur. Can I have Liam MacArthur's mic?
I'm very grateful to the Minister giving way. He's articulated, I think, the point I was suggesting at the end of my contribution, that there are many, many other factors to be borne in mind in terms of looking at the Spanish example. Nevertheless, it still remains a presumed consent arrangement, and therefore the concerns he's expressing about medical professionals were presumably the same in Spain as well, and therefore they found a way of getting around those issues and others raised by Jackson Carlo and Christine Graham.
Minister?
Sure, and I appreciate the point that Liam MacArthur is making. The reason I'm going through these particular points is to illustrate some of the issues that was considered by the task force at the time and the complexities around this particular area. And I think it's reasonable for the task force to have then concluded while moving to an opt-out system may deliver some benefits, it also carries significant risk and a danger of potentially making the situation worse. I think it may also be... I'll give way to Kenny Gibson.
Kenneth Gibson.
But the point I made in my opening speech was that the task force, looking at all the different aspects of opt-out policies, which are different across Europe, did still come to the conclusion themselves that, all else being equal, opt-out, soft opt-out still increases the number of organs available for donation by 25 to 30%, therefore saving lives.
Minister?
I think we shouldn't get into... I don't want to get this into a polarised debate, you're either for or against as such. What I'm trying to set out is some of the evidence that was presented to the task force in considering this matter, and that expert group then came forward with their recommendations. I think it may be also helpful if I just take the Chamber through some of the detail of the progress that has been made in Scotland over recent years, because a great deal of progress has been made. As a government, we are committed to implementing the recommendations of the Organ Donation Task Force, which have the goal of increasing the number of deceased organ donors by 50% by 2013. In Scotland, we have achieved that target 1 year early. We now have over 40% of the population on the register, which compares to 31% for the UK average. We've also taken forward work to strengthen the infrastructure across NHS Scotland. Specifically, we've appointed 7 additional organ donation specialist nurses. We've employed clinical leads for organ donation in every large hospital across the country, and we've established organ donation committees in every NHS board in Scotland. And unlike other parts of the UK, we have continued to run high-profile national publicity campaigns to raise awareness of organ donation every year. And members will be aware that I launched the new campaign just earlier this week. It's a campaign which is about encouraging people to talk about organ donation, to talk about possibly going on the organ donor register, and importantly, if they are on the organ donor register, to explain to their friends and relatives what their views are. This campaign is being supported by a new website for organ donation in Scotland, and we're also sending out 200,000 direct mail packs to Scots between November this year and March next year, in a campaign which will also be out and about in the supermarkets and shopping centres of Scotland over the coming weeks and months. And as in previous years, I believe that this campaign will prove to be successful. In Scotland, we also have legislation which allows everyone from the age of 12 to make their own decision about whether or not they want to donate their organs. and it is based upon the principle of authorisation, an expression which is intended to convey that people have the right to express during their lifetime the wishes that they wish to see be done with their body after death, in the expectation that those wishes will be respected. Presiding Officer, I think it's also very telling that Scotland currently has the highest authorisation rate in the UK for donations after brainstem death. It's just under 80% now, which compares very favourably to the average for the UK at 63%. Now, members will recognise that these developments over the last 3 years have started to make a real difference. In 2011-12, we saw 81 deceased organ donors in Scotland, the highest number ever. We also saw the highest number of transplants, the highest proportion of our population sign up to the register, and the highest authorisation rate for brainstem death. However, for the sake of the 600 people or so in Scotland on the waiting list for new organs, we need to make sure that these improvements are also sustainable. That's why we have said that opt-out is not completely off the agenda. There is a commitment to review this position across the UK in 2013, and we will take part in that particular review. The Welsh Assembly is currently looking to move to a system of soft opt-out, and I'm sure that we will learn more from their experience. However, we do have to acknowledge that progress has been made without an opt-out system at present, and the very real risks that also present themselves around an opt-out system. Presiding Officer, it's important to emphasise to all of us, no matter our position on opt-out, we share the same overall arching aim of increasing the number of organ donors in Scotland. All of us want to ensure that as many people as possible can benefit from the wonderful, life-saving gift that organ donors provide. I've got no doubt that over the coming year that we will have more discussion and debate on this issue, and I'm very grateful to the contributions that members have made here this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Minister. That concludes Kenneth Gibson's members' business. Time to introduce presumed consent, and I now suspend this meeting until 2:30 p.m.